The screaming started at 3 in the morning. In the Alexander Palace nursery, a small boy writhed in agony as blood pooled beneath the skin of his knee, swelling it to grotesque proportions. His mother, the Empress of all Russia, fell to her knees beside his bed, her diamond necklace catching the candlelight as she sobbed prayers in German-accented Russian. The boy was dying, not from plague or assassination or any external enemy, but from a single gene carried in his mother's blood. A microscopic flaw in his DNA that would bring down a 300-year-old empire and change the course of world history. This was August 1912. An 8-year-old Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian throne, was bleeding internally from a minor bump he'd taken while playing. His blood wouldn't clot. The doctors whispered the diagnosis like a death sentence: hemophilia. The royal disease that had already killed several of Queen Victoria's descendants was now eating away at the foundation of the Russian monarchy. As the Empress Alexandra clutched her son's burning hand, she made a desperate decision that would seal her family's fate. She sent for the only man who'd ever stopped her son's bleeding before, a filthy, drunken peasant from Siberia who claimed God spoke through him, a man whose very name would become synonymous with the fall of Imperial Russia, Grigory Rasputin. In that moment, watching her child's face turn grey with blood loss, Alexandra couldn't know she was trading her son's temporary salvation for her entire family's destruction. The disease that should have killed one boy would instead kill an empire, leaving 7 Romanovs riddled with bullets in a Siberian basement just 6 years later. This is the story of how a single defective gene toppled one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, how a mother's love became a nation's curse, and how the desperate fight to save one child doomed millions. The curse began with Queen Victoria, grandmother of Europe, carrier of catastrophe. She never knew the deadly lottery hidden in her genes when she married Prince Albert and bore 9 children. But when her 8th child, Leopold, began bleeding uncontrollably from minor cuts, the horrible truth emerged. The Queen carried hemophilia, and like a genetic time bomb, she'd planted it throughout European royalty. Her daughters became carriers, spreading the disease through marriage into the royal houses of Spain, Prussia, and most fatefully, Russia. Princess Alice passed it to her daughter, Alex of Hesse, a beautiful shy girl with red gold hair who would grow up to marry the last Tsar of Russia and take the name Alexandra Feodorovna. The disease travelled silently, invisible in female carriers, but deadly to their sons, waiting for the worst possible moment to strike. Nicholas and Alexandra's marriage was a love match, rare among royals. He called her Sonny. She called him Nicky, and their letters read like teenage romance novels despite being written by autocrats ruling 1/6 of the world's land. Their first 4 children were daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Each birth celebrated publicly, but privately disappointing. Russia's succession laws demanded a male heir. The pressure mounted with each girl, courtiers whispering about divorce, doctors prescribing fertility treatments, mystics promising miracle cures. Alexandra retreated into mysticism and illness, real and imagined, while Nicholas buried himself in state affairs. By 1904, after 3 years without another pregnancy, the imperial marriage was straining under the weight of an empty throne. Then, on July 30th, 1904, cannons boomed 300 times across St. Petersburg, announcing the birth of a son. Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, Tsarevich of Russia, arrived perfect and healthy, with his mother's eyes and his father's gentle features. Russia erupted in celebration. Peasants drank themselves unconscious on free vodka. Nobles competed to send the most lavish gifts, and Nicholas wept with joy, writing in his diary, "A great and unforgettable day for us. God has finally sent us a son." For 6 weeks, the imperial family lived in bliss. Alexandra recovered quickly, glowing with maternal pride. The baby thrived, gaining weight and charming everyone with his alertness. Then came the first sign of doom, a small bleeding from the navel that wouldn't stop. The imperial doctors huddled in conference, their faces grave. Dr. Eugene Botkin, the family physician, delivered the diagnosis with tears in his eyes. The Tsarevich had hemophilia, inherited through his mother's bloodline. There was no cure, no treatment beyond keeping the child still and praying. Any bump, any fall, Any tooth extraction could trigger unstoppable bleeding. Most haemophiliacs didn't survive childhood. Those who did lived as invalids wrapped in cotton wool, waiting for the inevitable hemorrhage that would kill them. Nicholas aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Alexandra collapsed, requiring sedation. When she woke, she was a different woman, harder, more desperate, convinced that God was testing her faith. The secret had to be kept at all costs. A weak heir was worse than no heir for a monarchy, already facing revolutionaries and reformers. The cover-up began immediately. The nursery became a fortress, with specially trained sailors carrying Alexei everywhere to prevent falls. His condition was disguised as delicate health in official statements. Even family members were kept in the dark, but secrets have a way of poisoning those who keep them. Alexandra withdrew from court life, spending her days hovering over Alexei, her nights praying for miracles. Nicholas, torn between his dying son and his crumbling empire, made increasingly poor decisions. The Russo-Japanese War ended in humiliating defeat. The 1905 revolution nearly toppled the throne. And through it all, the bleeding episodes continued, each one pushing Alexandra deeper into desperation and mysticism. She consulted faith healers, miracle workers, anyone who promised to save her son. Most were charlatans who fled when Alexei's bruises spread like purple storm clouds under his skin. By 1907, Alexandra had tried everything. Doctors from Germany, herbs from Tibet, prayers to obscure saints. Nothing worked. During one terrible episode, Alexei's leg swelled so badly, the doctors prepared his death announcement. Alexandra spent 3 days and nights by his bedside, neither eating nor sleeping, whispering prayers and promises to God. On the 4th day, as if by miracle, the bleeding stopped. The doctors had no explanation. But palace servants whispered about the strange peasant who'd been seen entering the palace the night before, a man with piercing eyes and healing hands. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and he would become both saviour and destroyer of the Romanov dynasty. Rasputin didn't look like salvation. He looked like what he was, a barely literate peasant from Siberia with fingernails caked in dirt and a beard that collected food particles. He stank of sweat, cheap wine, and something else witnesses couldn't define. A wild animal smell that made nobles step back when he entered a room. But his eyes were extraordinary. Pale blue and hypnotic, they seemed to see through flesh into soul. Women found him either irresistible or repulsive, often both. Men instinctively hated him. But to Alexandra, he was God's answer to her prayers, because somehow, inexplicably, when Rasputin prayed over Alexei, the bleeding stopped. The first documented miracle occurred in 1907. Alexei had fallen in the palace garden, triggering internal bleeding in his ankle. The joint swelled monstrously, the boy screaming in pain that laudanum couldn't touch. The doctors declared it hopeless. The hemorrhaging was too severe. Alexandra, hysterical with grief, agreed to let her friend Anna Vyrubova summon the holy man she'd been recommending. Rasputin arrived at midnight, pushing past protesting servants. He knelt beside Alexei's bed, placed his rough hands on the boy's forehead, and began to pray. Not the formal liturgy of Orthodox priests, but rambling personal conversations with God, mixed with peasant stories about horses and harvests. Within an hour, Alexei's breathing eased. By morning, the swelling had visibly reduced. The doctors called it coincidence. Alexandra called it a miracle. From that night forward, Rasputin became indispensable. Not officially, he was never given a formal position, but everyone knew that when Alexei bled, the empress sent for the peasant. And somehow, through prayer or hypnosis or sheer force of personality, Rasputin could calm the boy and slow the hemorrhaging. Modern historians suspect he may have used hypnotic techniques to reduce stress and lower blood pressure, genuinely helping the condition. But to Alexandra, the mechanism didn't matter. God had sent this man to save her son, and anyone who opposed him opposed God's will. This absolute faith would prove catastrophic, because Rasputin was far from holy. In St. Petersburg's darker corners, Rasputin lived a very different life. He drank prodigiously, boasting he could consume bottles of wine without effect. He seduced admirers of both sexes, claiming that physical union with him granted spiritual enlightenment. Police reports detailed orgies at his apartment, where society ladies waited in line for private blessings. He took bribes openly, selling his influence with the imperial family to the highest bidder. When confronted with his sins, he had a ready answer. How can one repent if one does not sin? I am cleansing souls through indulgence. The scandal grew weekly, but Alexandra refused to hear criticism. Those who tried to warn her found themselves exiled from court, or worse. The situation exploded into public view in 1912 during the family's vacation in Poland. Alexei, now 8, jumped into a boat despite warnings, triggering a massive hemorrhage in his groin and abdomen. The bleeding was catastrophic. His stomach distended with internal blood, his screams audible throughout the palace. The doctors gave him last rites. Nicholas prepared the death announcement, while Alexandra prayed ceaselessly. In desperation, she telegraphed Rasputin in Siberia. His response arrived the next day. The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him too much. That night, against all medical probability, the bleeding stopped. Alexei survived, though he remained bedridden for months. But the miracle came at a terrible price. Word of Rasputin's telegram leaked, confirming rumours about his influence. The story twisted in the telling. The mad monk controlled the throne through black magic. The German empress was his lover. The Tsarevich was cursed. By 1914, Rasputin's name was poison. Newspapers called him the Dark One, printing lurid stories about his debaucheries. The Duma, Parliament, debated his influence openly, with one deputy declaring, "The throne of the Romanovs is being shaken by an illiterate peasant." Nicholas tried repeatedly to send Rasputin away, but Alexandra always recalled him at the first sign of Alexei's illness. She wrote to her husband, "He is our friend sent by God. Without him, our son would be dead 5 times over." What she couldn't see was that keeping her son alive was killing the monarchy. Every miracle Rasputin performed deepened public suspicion. Every hemorrhage Alexei survived brought the revolution closer. The disease that should have been a private family tragedy had become a public relations catastrophe, with a Siberian peasant as its unlikely star. World War I transformed the Romanov family tragedy into a national catastrophe. When Russia mobilized in August 1914, Nicholas made the fateful decision to take personal command of the army, leaving Alexandra as regent in St. Petersburg. This meant leaving his hemophiliac son, an increasingly unstable wife, in the care of Rasputin, just as Russia faced its greatest crisis in centuries. The timing couldn't have been worse. Alexei had recently suffered another near-fatal episode, leaving Alexandra more dependent than ever on her friend. With Nicholas at the front, Rasputin's influence over state affairs grew exponentially. He didn't just heal the Tsarevich anymore, he appointed ministers. The wartime capital became a circus of corruption and incompetence. Rasputin, barely able to read, would scrawl recommendations on scraps of paper. Make this one minister of war, or remove that governor. He offends God. Alexandra, convinced these were divine revelations, pressured Nicholas to comply. Competent officials were replaced with Rasputin's drinking companions and bribe givers. The Minister of Internal Affairs was chosen because he'd arranged orgies for Rasputin. The Minister of Religion was appointed after his wife became Rasputin's lover. Russia's government, fighting a desperate war against Germany, was being staffed like a Siberian village council. Military supplies rotted in warehouses, while soldiers froze because the new logistics minister couldn't read maps. The Russian people, suffering massive casualties and food shortages, found a focus for their rage. The German empress and her peasant lover were deliberately sabotaging the war effort. Pamphlets circulated, showing Alexandra and Rasputin in obscene positions, with titles like The German Witch and Her Dog. The truth, that Alexandra was fanatically loyal to Russia and genuinely believed she was saving it through Rasputin's holy guidance, was far more tragic than any conspiracy. Her letters to Nicholas reveal a woman descending into religious mania, interpreting every military defeat as God testing their faith, every victory as Rasputin's prayers bearing fruit. "Our friend dreamed of a great light over Russia," she wrote after one catastrophic retreat. "This means God will soon grant victory." Nicholas, isolated at military headquarters, received increasingly frantic letters from relatives and ministers begging him to remove Rasputin. His mother, the Dowager Empress, broke protocol to write, Rasputin is destroying the dynasty and the empire. Grand Dukes threatened to renounce their titles if the peasant wasn't expelled. The British ambassador reported to London that the Russian monarchy was committing suicide in slow motion. But Nicholas, exhausted by military disasters and desperate to keep his son alive, always gave in to Alexandra's tears. "Better one Rasputin than 10 fits of hysterics a day," he told an aide. He didn't realise that by protecting his family's private healer, he was signing the dynasty's death warrant. By late 1916, even ultra-monarchists accepted that Rasputin had to die. Prince Felix Yusupov, married to Nicholas's niece, organised the assassination with a Grand Duke and a right-wing politician. On December 17th, they lured Rasputin to Yusupov's palace with promises of meeting his beautiful wife. The murder became legendary for its botched execution. Poisoned cakes that didn't work, multiple gunshots that didn't kill, the body dumped in the frozen Neva River. When Rasputin's corpse was recovered, water in the lungs suggested he'd still been alive when thrown in the river. His death solved nothing. Alexandra collapsed into hysterical grief, convinced God had abandoned Russia. Alexei, sensing his mother's despair, suffered a severe hemorrhage that nearly killed him. The government, staffed with Rasputin's incompetent appointees, continued to disintegrate. The revolution began 2 months later, sparked by bread riots in St. Petersburg. Within days, 3 centuries of Romanov rule evaporated like morning mist. Nicholas, returning from the front to find his capital in chaos, abdicated in a railway car, signing away an empire with the same pen he'd used to approve Rasputin's recommendations. The provisional government placed the family under house arrest at Alexander Palace, where the drama had begun 13 years earlier with Alexei's birth. The boy, now 12, remained fragile but alive. The supreme irony being that revolution cured what medicine couldn't. Without the stress of maintaining an empire, without the constant pressure of hiding his condition, Alexei's health actually improved in captivity. His bleeding episodes became less frequent, his spirits higher. He played with toy soldiers and read adventure books, unaware that his family's adventure was heading toward its final chapter. The Romanovs spent their last year in a steadily tightening noose. First came comfortable house arrest at Alexander Palace, where they gardened, performed plays, and maintained the fiction of normalcy. Alexei, freed from the burden of being heir to a non-existent throne, thrived as much as a haemophiliac could. He learned to cook, chopped wood carefully, and delighted in being an ordinary boy. Alexandra, stripped of power and separated from the mystics who'd enabled her delusions, seemed to find a kind of peace. She wrote in her diary, "God's will be done." Perhaps this is his way of saving Alexei, by making him nobody special. If only she'd realised this truth 13 years earlier. But comfort was temporary. As civil war erupted between Reds and Whites, the Romanovs became dangerous symbols. The Bolsheviks moved them to Tobolsk in Siberia, a gentler exile where locals still crossed themselves when the family passed. Alexei suffered a severe hemorrhage during the journey but survived. No Rasputin needed, just rest and his mother's prayers. For 8 months, they lived quietly, the girls teaching local children, Nicholas chopping wood, Alexandra embroidering. The haemophilia that had destroyed their empire became just another manageable family challenge. Alexei even made friends with some of the guards, who carried him when his joints ached and carved him wooden toys. Everything changed in April 1918, when the ultra-radical Ural Soviet took custody. The family was moved to Ekaterinburg, to a merchant's house ominously renamed the House of Special Purpose. The windows were painted white, high fences erected, machine guns positioned. These weren't guards anymore, but executioners waiting for orders. The family knew. Alexandra sewed jewels into the girls' corsets, not to fund an escape, but as armour against bullets. Nicholas taught Alexei chess, both pretending not to notice their captors, testing the basement walls for the best angles of fire. On July 4th, Alexei turned 14, celebrating with a small cake and prayers. He would live 13 more days. The end came in the early hours of July 17th, 1918. The family was awakened and told to dress. There was unrest in the town. They needed to move to the basement for safety. Alexandra, sensing the truth, helped Alexei dress carefully, wrapping his thin body in as many layers as his haemophilia-weakened frame could bear. They descended to the cellar, Nicholas carrying Alexei, Alexandra clutching an icon. the 4 girls in their jewel-lined corsets. 11 people in a small basement room, waiting. The commander, Yakov Yurovsky, entered with a squad of men. He read a brief statement about the Ural Soviets' decision to execute them. Nicholas had time to say what before the shooting started. The execution was as botched as Rasputin's murder. The jewels in the girls' corsets deflected bullets, forcing soldiers to use bayonets. Alexei, protected by his father's body initially, survived the first volley. Yurovsky found him crawling toward the door, leaving a trail of blood, the hemophiliac bleeding one last time. 2 shots to the head ended the life that an empire had died trying to save. The bodies were burned with acid, bones smashed with rifle butts, remains scattered in an unmarked forest pit. The Romanov dynasty ended not with imperial grandeur, but with broken bodies in a Siberian wood, victims of the disease that had started in their blood and metastasized through their empire. For decades, Soviet historians blamed the execution on local officials exceeding orders. Documents revealed later showed Lenin personally approved the killings. The hemophiliac prince and his sisters were too dangerous to live, even as children. The irony was complete. The disease that should have killed Alexei in infancy instead killed his entire family in a basement, along with millions who died in the civil war that followed. All because a mother loved her son too much to let him die naturally. Because a weak emperor couldn't say no to his wife. Because a peasant healer's influence mattered more than an empire's stability. Hemophilia, that tiny genetic flaw passed down from Queen Victoria, had claimed its ultimate victims. The Romanov murders shocked even hardened revolutionaries. But the real tragedy wasn't in that Ekaterinburg basement. It was in the cascade of catastrophes that led there, all triggered by a single defective gene. Think about it. If Alexei had been healthy, there would have been no Rasputin. No Rasputin meant no discredited monarchy. No discredited monarchy might have meant no revolution, no Lenin, no Stalin, no Cold War. The entire 20th century pivoted on a child's inability to form blood clots. One genetic mutation inherited from a British queen reshaped global history. This isn't just about royal haemophilia. It's about how personal desperation can destroy political judgment, how love can become destructive when it blinds us to larger responsibilities. Alexandra wasn't evil, just a mother watching her child die slowly. Nicholas wasn't weak, just a husband trying to keep his family together. But their private trauma became public catastrophe because they couldn't separate parental love from imperial duty. In trying to save one boy, they sacrificed an empire and millions of lives. Modern genetic testing could have prevented all of it. A simple blood test would have revealed Alexandra's carrier status before marriage. Today's treatments would have let Alexei live normally. But in 1904, love, faith, and desperation were the only medicines available, and they proved fatal. The disease that doomed the Romanovs reminds us that history often turns on biology, that the personal is always political when power is involved, and that sometimes the greatest catastrophes begin with the smallest flaws. If you want to hear more forgotten stories about how tiny details changed world history, subscribe. Because understanding the past might be our only hope of not repeating it.